as we speak. So
well, I hope you guys survive it. You tend to do just fine. You have the shoes, the mud boots, so you'll be fine. Hello, Pam Salem. And Emily, welcome. We're just going to wait a little bit and then get going. What were you saying, Callie?
the same thing, Michael. Yeah, just that we'll give another minute or two for people who may be joining and then hit the road. Did anybody either want to say in the chat or speak up while we're waiting, have a chance to take any of those implicit bias tests that we posted the link to a couple days ago?
Well, it definitely looks at this point like we'll be a small enough group that we can have a conversation and people can chime in verbally. So unless the throngs arrive, why don't we do that? So I would suggest, Callie, it is 3:32 and we are not going to punish the people who are on time. We will get going.
That sounds wonderful to me, yeah. Welcome to our small little group that we have here today. Michael and I are really, really excited to continue the kind of conversation that, I don't know, I think it's been building not just this month, but over, you know, since maybe last year, but especially over the last couple of guides we've done, this growing idea about shifting consciousness and shifting the way we engage with one another and with ourselves. And as we were looking at what we wanted this month's guide to be, that theme of implicit bias and those unconscious beliefs that we hold and how those interact with our day-to-day interactions, both personally and professionally. What does that look like? How is it phasing us now? What can we do about it? So that's kind of, Michael, do you think that's a good summary of kind of what we're thinking today?
I think so. I think so. And how it came about is the involvement with diversity, equity, inclusion. You know, right now for PATH International, I'm sort of fortunate to be I'm the chair of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, and the board is really trying to figure out what that topic really means to PATH International. And at the end user side, so the participants, but really even more so the practitioner, the people offering therapeutic horsemanship, instructors, centers, what does it mean? And in the process, I've just been able to do a little bit of education of myself. And I ended up stumbling across these Harvard implicit bias tests. And, you know, I always thought of myself as very self-aware, but taking these tests, and they're really interesting. So no one's taken them yet. Priscilla, are you familiar with them? Shake your head if you're not.
I'm not sure what they are because I didn't look at those. We did some that were more identifying. It was kind of more of a lesson in seeing how compassionate you are.
Yeah, interesting. So how Harvard tests are set up is you can take one on particularly African-American attitude, or overweight people, or gay, lesbian, gay, transgender. So they different categories, and they are set up as these active tests that you take on your keyboard, and they're very fast, and you just have to go with your gut instinct on what you're being asked on the screen. And you then at the end up with a score that either reflects strong bias for, strong bias against, minor bias for, minor bias against, or no bias. And sorry, Pam, I see your speaker isn't connecting. Ugh, that's frustrating. And when I took them, I took a couple, LGBTQ, I took, and I was just really surprised by my result. And it wasn't what I was expecting. And it's not about sharing what my results were, but what it showed me is that an implicit bias, you can be kind of blind to it or not even aware that you've got it. And I think that was the interesting piece to me. Callie, what about you?
Yeah, I think what is really intriguing to me about, well, the conversation in general, especially in a group like this, is that I think we all want to feel pretty woke, right? We all want to feel like we are on the right side of things, that we are making good decisions, that we're open-minded people, that we don't have biases or prejudices. And I think that's the way most of us go through the world day to day. It's, a protective factor maybe. But especially in today's society, when, we look at cancel culture or something, people are maybe more mindful, but I think the question is, are we more mindful about how we're thinking about people and things, or are we more mindful about how we're speaking about people and things? And that's where these kinds of tests can really become at least a tool for reflection, because I was surprised. I know I was by quite a few of them. And my first initial reaction was like, well, something's got to be wrong with these tests. These can't be right because I don't have biases and I'm not, blah, 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 blah. I was just really put off. And I had to sit back for a second and say, well, I didn't have a problem when I got what I felt was accurate on the other 12. So maybe there is an area here that I need to look at. And I think it's an intriguing idea for us to be digging like that and to just be reflective and open about what those results might be.
Right. And of course, one of my questions then is, biases aren't necessarily bad, good, they just are. And we function with them all the time. And think about the horse industry. Good God, how biased are we in the horse industry? One group, the quarter horse people, have tremendous bias against the, people who show different breeds, and different breeds think other breeds are better. So we have that. And ultimately our conversation has to tie back to the work we do. And, which could be as therapists, as program leaders, as therapeutic horsemanship instructors, facilitators, and how do we operate with bias? So I guess, being that we're still rather small, I want to sort of throw it out to some of you and be brave to jump in. What does bias mean to you personally in your work and in your life? We're not here to do group therapy necessarily, but we want to talk about how bias plays into what we do and how we function. Who's going to be brave? What does bias mean anything to you in your work? Is that even a topic?
So Priscilla says something that came out of their discussions was how biased people can be without any experience. That comes from a monochromatic community. So people have gotten their biases not from real encounters or experiences, which I think is a really great point. Yeah, I can think of a number of times across multiple areas where that's been true. And Priscilla, that's one of the things for me when I was taking the test that I really thought about is so much about bias, right? And the idea behind implicit bias being that it is something we're unconscious of. It's not like, I don't like this, I don't like broccoli because it gets stuck in my teeth, that's not an implicit bias. But this idea that we have biases that are, I don't want to say inherent, because it's not like a steady thing or a necessary part of us, but maybe a natural thing. And I wondered, when I was taking those tests and when I was reflecting on where my biases may be, if that wasn't it. It's just cultures or communities that I have no familiarity with at all. And so, yeah, there probably is a little bias towards cultures that I do feel safer with, right? And that's not because another culture is bad or another person is bad. It's just because I know this one. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And also it's very difficult to talk about these topics because, as you said, I think all of us want to be so perfect and non-offensive, and we want to do the right thing, or at least I believe we want to do the right thing. So I think there increasingly now is a little bit of fear in talking about some of these things. For myself also, what was really interesting, and I guess I will share one, being LGBTQ and all, I, have lived with that all of my life and thought about it a lot, and obviously have my experiences and political opinions on it and so forth. And I took the implicit bias test. And what I came up with is that I have an implicit bias against LGBTQ. And I got that one. I was like, what? This test sucks. But the flip side of it is once I got to thinking about it, after a lifetime of being exposed to negative thinking, negative messages daily in the media, in life, in family, and so forth, why wouldn't I have absorbed some level of negativity? And that results in a bias. And obviously it's a bias I steer against, and it's one that I think I can master and handle, but it's there. And I think that showed me the depth of it. And I think you can take that into every direction. People with disability, people with chronic illness. Again, I mentioned people who are from their physical stature out of the norm in any direction. Age, how we treat people who are older, people who are younger, people who are mentally not sort of average IQ or above. I think that's relevant because we work with all types of people, and we reach out to all types of people, and we want all types of people to be part of our industry and our work, whether it's ground work only, whether it's mounted work with horses.
Michael, so in that vein, when you think about, mounted work, especially the thought that not everybody is appropriate for mounted work, Priscilla asks a great question here. She says, where do the lines blur between bias and discernment? Something we talked about was how our biases have a positive polarity in certain circumstances. It's hard and maybe not completely sensible to be bias-free. What are your thoughts? I have a couple, but I'd love to hear yours too, Michael. I don't know if.
Go Callie.
All right.
By the way, Priscilla, if you're comfortable at all, I'd love to hear your voice. I mean, chat is good, but we're here in real time, and so do not hesitate to chime in. We're not speakers. We're sort of like conversation generators.
Yeah. I definitely consider myself here in a student role as much as anybody else or anything else. I thought I had these exact same thoughts, Priscilla, when I was thinking about this conversation, and I was doing a lot of looking into it because I have thought all the way back to conversations when I was 18 in the Army, 20 some years ago. and talking about the difference between prejudging and prejudice. And what I think it kind of comes down to, if I, bubbling it down, this is a pretty simplified answer, but is it going to cause harm to somebody else or to yourself? Or is it going to be something that keeps yourself and others safe? And I think maybe that's not a firm line, but if we're going to start thinking about how blurry that line is, I think for me, that's one of the key things that I was able to boil it down to, is does it have the risk to harm?
Well, this is Pam, and I couldn't hear the first part of this because my speaker didn't work. But I think that we can harm without the intent to harm.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
If we're not aware of our biases, and maybe that's how we learn when somebody steps back on our toes and says, "Excuse me." So I can remember when this field first started, and there was a bias about equine assisted and equine facilitated among horse people. Now, when we're talking about bias now, it's more about, people and their orientations, I guess. Like I said, I missed the first part of this, and I don't know what test you're talking about, and I haven't taken it.
Pam, just to interrupt real briefly, that's what you're talking about. You're spot on. We're talking about implicit bias and the biases that we don't know we have and how they impact our personal and professional lives. So
Great.
you're spot on there. That it's the
Well,
ones
Callie,
that we have.
when I think about it, I like what Priscilla said about discernment. I have one of my favorite scriptures is the one where Christ sent his disciples out, and he said, "You must be wise as serpents and guileless as doves." So if we approach it without guile, we probably come out a little bit better.
What was that first part again with the serpents?
He sent his disciples out, and he said, "I send you out as sheep unto wolves. You must be wise as serpents and guileless as doves."
I see.
Some translations.
So that does imply that we do. That does imply a level of discernment.
Yeah.
Yeah, some translations of the Bible have that as gentle as doves or as innocent as doves. With the innocent, they're meaning truly sincere. Coming at it, being real, being genuine, being true, being gentle, while still being wise. If that helps.
Absolutely.
Right.
Makes it easier to understand. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to kind of bounce off of what's been said already, I think when welfare is involved, and I think Priscilla spoke to that, and so did Callie, when welfare is involved, that's a line that is drawn to prevent harm. And that is where it's no longer, you're not making that bias, you're not making the decision off of a bias, you're making it off of almost the Hippocratic Oath, step one, do no harm.
Right.
And rolling from there. And just a little background, I am a CTRI as well as an ESMHL. And primarily as a CTRI, my goal is to teach the riding skill, honoring the life journey of the client, while also advocating for the horse and what the horse needs and the program in general. And then it's interesting when people are like, well, aren't you biased because aren't you, I've heard it talked about before where there's a question of whether or not a center has bias or is not compliant with ADA if they don't serve a particular type of client for mounted lessons. And like, well, no, because somewhere in the ADA laws, there's lines about if you can't do it, if it cannot, services cannot be rendered safely, then there is no obligation.
Sure,
So
sure. Yeah, Emily,
line.
that's really good, and I like how you introduced that. Pam, I'm going back to what you were saying about how we can hurt and we can upset people without even wanting or meaning or trying to. That definitely is an interesting one that resonates, because you know, oftentimes, particularly in the DEI space, diversity, equity, inclusion, the mainstream culture often isn't aware and isn't even aware of some of the wounds and the injuries, and you know what commonly now is called the microaggressions, which is really not intended to aggress, but it ends up. And you know,
exactly. I mean, I live in Tennessee, and while that's not deep South, it took me a while to understand why on earth they wanted the Confederate statues taken down. You know,
right.
I mean, I understand it now, but I grew up in the basement of a gift shop, Michael, and we sold Confederate flags. And so, you know, there was no meaning of any negative kind behind that to me as a child.
Right.
But I can certainly see how that meaning arises out of people whose ancestors were slaves.
Yeah, they're totally different experience. Absolutely.
Exactly.
You know, and then what I also really liked is the kindness approach, the genuine, the sort of the humbleness and willing to learn and willing to step back. And I think Pam again said a word that really is important: stepping back and just going, oh, wait a minute, I didn't know what I said, or I didn't mean that, or I've got to learn. And I've been shut down a couple of times in the last year in DEI conversations in sort of no uncertain terms because I used a wrong word or something. And it almost makes you a little bit scared, but I think letting go of that fear is important too, because we can only improve and learn by engaging in the conversation. Shutting down and stepping back is not the way to go. And again, it's not about being perfect.
I think it's really hard to separate kind of inherent bias and cultural bias, because, you know, I'm kind of piggybacking a little bit on what Pam said. And I live in a very agricultural area now that is contiguous to a very intellectual area. And I mean, the two communities couldn't be more different, and they're filled with wonderful people, but who, because of their cultures, have very different values. And so where does a value become a bias? I mean, I just think it gets to be such a slippery slope. And I'm sorry to hear you say, Michael, you know, that you got called out in the middle of people trying to be so, you know, perfect and politically correct. It's like, we just don't give people much slack anymore. And that's become a cultural thing too. But I think if you're able to, as someone with intent, to be able to go different places and keep in your mind that I'm stepping into another culture here that has its own integrity, and within that there are very clear boundaries about social interactions, and you can't know what you don't know. I mean, you just can't. I think we have a lot of expectations sometimes that people will know what we know, and they don't. And we have to be flexible, I think, more flexible than we are for sure.
And does that fall, I guess, on both of us? As I'm curious, sorry for my dog barking, about how, what the phrase that you said, and I hear it a bunch. Oh, I feel so sorry, Michael, that you got called out like that. You were just meaning to be good. You were trying to be connective, and then you got called out. And now, and for a lot of people, maybe you don't even want to be in that space now. I think there's a middle ground there where we can say, wow, that was kind of cool that you got called out like that. And now you have all of this knowledge and perspective that you didn't have yesterday. And I don't think that, you know, calling people out, or maybe I would use the word inviting them into conversation, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing when we ask people to recognize their biases. And I think for me, that's the key of today. Like, biases that we're aware of, you may have a million reasons why you have that bias. And so to always be examining it and looking at it is really important. But a lot of us have biases that we have no clue of. And here is a personal example for me that is not as big as flags or culture, but I take my mom to medical appointments with me because she has to drive me, because I can't drive that far because of the medications I have to take because of the infections I've had over the last couple of years. And consistently, I have doctors look and speak to my mom and not to me. Now, if I take my mom to an appointment because she has to take medication because she's having a procedure done, her doctors will look at me and talk to me and not her. Do you guys, so the bias there, and I would argue it's an implicit bias. I don't think the doctors know they're doing it at all. But the bias is that the patient or the client is not as capable as their caretaker, and so that the caretaker is the one who needs the information. Now, for me, I am calling my doctors out a little bit. If I say, hey, I'm over here, or I say, actually, I've done a lot of research on this, or if I bring their attention back to me, I am calling them out on it. But
Yes.
it doesn't have to be in a way that says, hey, you're a crappy doctor, you're not doing the right thing. It's just inviting you to say, hey, there's another way of doing this. Oh, sorry for this phone call. There's another way of doing this, and I'd like to invite you to have that conversation with me. And I know not everybody's doing that, but I think there's room for it.
There is, but you know what I also really have learned is that I have to be a little bit more thick-skinned. And the reason being, for someone, let's take you, let's say you go to a lot of doctors again and again, and this happens again and again and again with different doctors. There comes that point when you reach that level of your frustration and your anger with this is just, you can't be nice anymore at that point. And I think that I've found that in some of these DEI conversations with individuals of color, individuals of different ethnicities, religious groups, I think when it's like the drip, 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 and then you've just had it, and you've been so immersed in this, and it's so personal now that it is hard. And so for myself, if I walk into it, sometimes it's good to remind myself that this isn't about me, Michael Kaufmann, personal. This is about more than that. And that has helped a little bit, because of course my feelings get hurt if someone jumps on me. But whoa, poor Michael. Okay, so my feelings get hurt a little bit. Big whoop, you know. This other person has dealt with something all of their life, and clearly there's an injury there.
Yeah, and that this really cool idea that, like, even in those moments of drip, 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 when they happen really big, that if we, as the other person who's engaging with them, have even just a little bit of room to recognize that and offer them space, then that that can relieve a little bit of room for the drip. And so maybe they might not be so angry for the next, maybe they will be, but it's
of course, Callie, anger is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
I mean, movements, many social movements, there has always been the more radical, the more vocal, whether it's feminism, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's, you know, right across the board. And so that's an element that is needed to shift perception, and biases and all reduce and change over time because of these movements making an impact, and it happens in different places at different speeds and in different hearts at different rates. But it's important to have that anger somewhere. It's like one needs it too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, look at the individuals with disabilities who fought for the the accessibility rights in the 1990s. I mean, that wouldn't have happened just by people being nice.
Right. No, and I guess I don't mean to imply that.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing with what you're
No,
saying at all.
yeah. I guess it just made me wonder if I was unclear in what I was saying, I guess, maybe that there can be connection and anger. Maybe that there can be both of those things that like, I don't know.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the preference is to be more the educator, and to be more gentle, and to turn it into a positive.
Well, when I was taking care of my husband, he was 21 years older than me. And I finally told one doctor, if he said one more time, well, he's just old, I said, I don't care if he's old. I care if he gets care for this particular problem now.
Right.
And so I did have to get angry. And it took me 2 months after he died for the tension to go out of my shoulders, having to fight for his rights as an old person.
Yep. Drip, drip. Exactly.
And one time I said to the Humana nurse I said to her, I hate that I'm being such a bitch. And she said, oh, no, Miss Salem, you're not being a bitch, you're being an advocate.
Yes.
So that's one way to look at it.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great way to look at it. So I am curious to know if anybody has ideas or what we might be able to do to reduce those implicit biases in ourselves. So I think what we were just talking about, what Pam made an excellent point about, is that she had to be advocate for her husband up until the day he died. If he needed something, she needed to advocate for it because of all of these implicit biases that her doctors didn't know they had, right? And that's the whole point of it being an implicit bias. As soon as Pam brings it to their attention, it's no longer implicit. It's their job to like work on it, recognize it, and work through it, right? So what, if any, kind of ideas do you guys have that we might be able to use to work through if we have implicit biases, what those implicit biases are, and how to kind of maneuver our way through them? Does anybody have thoughts?
I think it's good to have language to do that. I remember going to therapy many, many years ago, like maybe 40, and I said, I want to learn how to say no instead of hell no. And I didn't have the language that I needed to be able to talk to people. And when I get on my last nerve, I don't always have good language. So I think if we can learn, to have phrases to use that we can practice is a start.
Yeah, what also comes into it is timing and time, and sometimes listening. It's the old one, listen before you speak. Take a deep breath, step back, don't react in the moment. That can be a self-help too. I've really tried to do that, particularly with staff or situations that I encounter at work where maybe a few years ago I might have jumped on it. I said something in the moment, corrected something. I'll sleep on it and I'll wait for a day. And the next day, usually it already looks quite a bit different. And when one has the luxury to do that, I find that helpful.
I think there's a way to take the charge out of the word bias, because it's just a definition. It's just a dictionary word. But we are so afraid of having it or being accused of it that I mean, I go back to our discussion. It was largely, middle school and high school kids, but the way it got approached was through a lot of creativity. We did a lot of writing around it and just exploring it rather than coming in and saying, we really have to change this in all our programming and kind of the way we market things and whatever, that it becomes such a bad thing. And that's why I go back to the links between bias and discernment, and understanding one's own culture and then making a choice to be part of another culture. Possibly, maybe people choose not to, but I just feel like it's one of those words that, it gets to be literally a buzzword. And if we're going to change it, I think it has to be safe to talk about it, to have it, to make a choice of what we want to do with the biases that we have. I'm biased towards kind people. I don't really want to change that. I mean, I really enjoy being around kind people. And I do have a bias around being by people who are violent. I think that gets into discernment, but I don't want to change that about myself. But I would like to change other biases that I know I have a bias against, pretty strong one, about organized religion, because I feel like it is so narrowing for people and it becomes a way of judging rather than including. That is my admitted bias. And I live in an extremely religious community now, and I've had to just shut up, and go with that flow.
Priscilla, you're right. Callie and I were at that very point in our pre-conversation, because one of the things I'm also aware of, and it's right what you're talking about, diversity, equity, inclusion means everybody. And how do we practice this and really effectively do it in a culture in our country that now has become so divisive, politically, socially, and exactly what you're saying. So I'm going to ask you, is it about segregating then? Is it about finding your bubble and your comfort zone and the people you're with? Or can we get past this sort of polarization, I guess?
I think there's a difference between, allowing yourself and others around you to find a comfort zone and to be there. But are you willing to get bigger? And I think that's part of the widening back, is, okay, can I take a little bigger perspective here? Having my comfort, appreciating the things that I feel do no harm with my own bias, like trying to be kind and encourage people to be kind. That's my own judgment that I think the world needs it. And so I go out and I try and teach that. But I don't know. I mean, I think that when we explore things like this, there's always a risk that we're going to come up against things that we don't like. Then what do we do with it? And that's kind of where I am. I was like, okay.
Anybody want to jump in?
Ken Key said to take offense adds pain to the universe. But there is a point when you need to set a boundary. And I don't know that it means we need to take offense, but we need to state with clarity, excuse me, but that was my toe.
So I have a question for pretty much everybody in the group. Right now, I think what we're talking about is explicit bias. We're talking right now about, I know I don't like people who are aggressive or physically violent, but sorry for the dog. So now what do I do about it? I know I don't like being around people who, this is me speaking personally too, I'm not just repeating what you were saying, Priscilla, but I also have a problem with organized religion. I don't really like it. So I'm examining it a lot. I'm trying to decide what I'm going to do about it. But how do you guys think we go about learning about the biases that we don't know we have? Because that's what we're really interested in today. how do you figure it out? Like, how do you get to that point where you go, oh shit, I didn't realize I don't like this, that, or the other thing? What is that moment? Go ahead. Yes, please. I saw your hand go up, Emily.
Thanks. Well, just the first thing that comes to mind is to take a look around in your spheres of influence, whether you spend a lot of time on social media, in person with friends, or connecting in some other way. Look around and see who's missing. This came from a friend of mine. A friend of mine in college was posting when summer 2020 rolled around and the Black Lives Matter movement really took off. And I have this large circle of friends who are from predominantly white communities who've always just happened to live in very white affluent communities. And they're like, well, wait, well, how do I go about educating myself without putting the burden on people of minority to come and explain everything to me, because they're not my teachers. They don't owe me anything in that education department. And one of the parts that I loved to hear was, you have to look around and see who's missing. Look at the people you follow on social media as far as influencers go, or even just frequent posters. How many of them look different from you or behave differently from you in any regard? Or do they all kind of look and act exactly like you? And if the first thing you see is that something's missing, it might be time. It might be something as simple as, joining some discussion boards on Facebook for the sake of reading along and educating yourself. It might be something as easy as following, let's see, for example, my sister-in-law is like really into hair and makeup theater. So she made a point of going out and finding minority artists who were costume artists or who were makeup artists. And she's like, I want to see how their culture and how their lives influence their makeup. And I want to hear what they have to say. And that it's not huge, but it's a small step to start including these things that are not like you into your daily living. And then after that, a matter of self-education, right? If you want to learn something, you have to go out and learn it. And if that means finding a nice little community college that has some diversity and inclusion type classes, history is a great place to start. Then maybe it means going and auditing a class. Maybe it means finding an online class. Maybe it means joining a community. That's where I'd start.
All I have to do is go on this group that I have in my neighborhood called Seymour Speaks Out, and they're all from the red spectrum instead of the blue spectrum. And so I just go there and listen, and I see how they think. And I don't engage, but I'm trying to understand what they're angry about. And some of it makes you grit your teeth on my belief systems, but I just listen and I just watch and I just read, and then I can understand why some of them are so angry. And it's really helped me to have a broader view politically without, engaging and polarizing. So I think that's a good suggestion.
Wonderful.
Pam, I have a question for you, Pam. How much do you think fear motivates people and sort of sets them in their way? Because I just feel, and fear is just such a strong emotion that elicits so much behavior that then comes across as defensive or aggressive. And
well, I think you're exactly right, Michael, because in my particular study of just political culture, it seems to be that people with a lot of fear, that's one of the reasons that the autocratic mindset has risen, because they want somebody decisive that is going to protect them. And it's really interesting to watch why they support an autocratic figure, and why do the people, the evangelical community, why would on earth would they, support someone so unloving. And but it goes back to the fear of not being protected, and the fact that maybe this person with the big club will be the one that will protect us. So, I do think a lot of the reactions go back to fear. It's just like a lot of anger goes back to fear.
Sure.
So we're getting ready, close already to that hour. I want to make sure I have a couple of minutes to list these off so that we can talk about them if we want to. When I was exploring all of this, and I love the questions you guys have asked, because it's like the exact same things that were running through my mind as I was preparing for this. Like, when do we cross the line between this or that? And when is it good? And when is it bad? And how do we use it? And how do we identify it? So there was one university website that talked a little bit about tactics that we can use to reduce our implicit bias. And a lot of them are what you guys have been talking about today. So the first one they listed was introspection. The next one was mindfulness. I think that all of that is just asking the questions, like observing, examining what you do like, what you don't like, and then just starting to ask questions: why, where, how, when. Perspective taking, which I think Leaf had talked a little bit in the comments. Try and put your shoes in, or put yourself in another person's shoes a little bit. That's, where we were talking about all this culture piece before, but also learning. I love that we've talked about all of these, learning to slow down. I think our culture has gotten us so used to everything going fast and being on 3 apps at the same time and having your phone and your notebook and your computer and you're this and you're that. And maybe just saying, "Whoa, I had a big reaction to that. I'm going to take a day or two and kind of process it, go back to the first couple of steps." But also, yeah, individualization. Let's look at the person and not the culture, not the disability community, not the, one way if we're trying to reduce our implicit biases is to really take the time to get to know and understand a single person, and then generalize later as we get the opportunity. The last 2 big ones were check your messaging and institutional fairness, which I thought was really interesting, which is kind of, that piece, not just about organized religion, but like pay attention to who you're hanging out with and who you're going to school with and who you're listening to all the time. Because if the messaging that's coming into you all the time is giving you a bias, you're going to have it. And especially like workplace settings is a huge one. I don't think I've ever worked in a place that has a bad environment where people were working well and being motivated and innovative. They just slowly started behaving the way they were taught to. And the last one was just do it all over again. Just keep going through those steps all the time, constantly asking yourself questions. And I am really, really appreciative of this group, because I think what this shows me is that we had a little bit of a hard time having a discussion about implicit bias, because you guys are already asking all of these questions all the time. And so maybe our job is to just figure out, I don't know, are we integrating it? Are we, I don't know what the next question is. Does anybody have thoughts?
Well, I would like to speak to the bias on organized religion for just a moment, because I've had that also. I went to try to get pallets for my hay at a local Christian school, and they were teaching things in the classroom that made my hair rise up in anger, and I wanted to storm in there. And so I went that weekend to a Spiritual Frontiers meeting, and there was a man there from the Coptic Fellowship. And I was raging about how they were teaching this particular bias, and that it wasn't what Christ taught. And he held up his hand, and he had to call my name several times because I was on a roll. And he said, "Pam," he said, every religion on this earth is there so that the person in it can learn. And we respect them all. Well, I went home and I thought about that. And I thought if every soul had a pathway that had to learn a certain thing, and that religion was there for them to learn from, then, okay, I would just have to let it go. And so that was many years ago, and that has helped me. There's some I don't want to have anything to do with, but that helped my perspective. So I just share that going forward.
That's interesting, and obviously the religious side of it is definitely a topic in the small group we have today. Tell you the two things that I'm going to sort of think on, and Callie, you sort of really pinpointed it, is the difference between implicit and explicit. And I hadn't really thought about that much. And there's obviously a spectrum there, and there's a sort of a borderline between one and the other. And when does one become the other? And, you know, so that's really just fascinating. And then the second one is, you know, while there certainly is a mainstream culture and a dominant culture in our country, I also just really find intersectionality interesting, in that every one of us walks in different realms based on our history, our family, our own tradition, our religion, whatever it is. So we have a horse in several races, not just one. And often we don't even know, you know, where Pam or Priscilla or Callie, you know, really comes from, and how you got to be who you are and where you are. And of course, including myself.
I'm gonna get so mushy right now. When we were doing our course on human horse history when I was in college, and we went through like the entire evolution of the relationship between horses and humans, and what we kind of came to the conclusion as a class was that for whatever reason, the domestication of the horse happened across continents, across the planet at relatively similar points in time, and it fundamentally shifted humanity. The way we did everything changed once we paired ourselves with horses. And I kind of feel that way about intersectionality. I feel like there's this really, really important thing about the weaving of cultures and the weaving of ideas that is going to be really essential to humanity being able to, you know, move forward in a healthy way. But that's just a silly personal thought.
Well, there is no silly thought, and you know, we were not put here to have solutions or solid outcomes. Thank God, we were tasked to have an interesting conversation with folks who showed up.
Yeah.
And I feel we have. I really thank you guys who participated. You really helped us, because while Callie and I had sort of a little bit of a pathway, we really didn't have a solid goal. So, Callie, how do you want to leave it? Does anyone have a concluding thought, something they have to still share and have to get out there?
Yeah, or questions, or just thoughts. I think, next steps, Lisa. Yes.
Our next steps. What's a personal next step for you, Priscilla, based on this almost hour that we've spent together?
Oh, I'm going to do those Harvard questionnaire things, because we didn't do those. But I mean, I just want to say something about, you know, implicit bias and explicit bias. I mean, again, I go back to you can't know what you don't know, but implicit biases, they're like our blind spots. I mean, we just don't see them. So to even talk about them is really hard for most people, because they don't even know they exist. You know, they don't think about their appendix every day. I mean, it's just kind of there. And I think that, you know, moving forward, you know, certainly what we do in our program, I throw all this stuff out to the kids all the time. I mean, they're stuck with me, you know, and we talk about these kinds of things. But just sharing with friends. Like, wow, I had this great conversation the other day and I did this cool little exercise. You might want to try it. I'll send you the link. I mean, even if you get 5 friends to realize, my gosh, I do have these inherent biases that I didn't think about. Even if they don't want to change them, it might be a little bit of a trigger that they think, wow, I bet other people have these too. And maybe I shouldn't judge them because maybe they're acting out of an implicit bias that they don't know yet or don't fully understand yet. So I mean, that's what I'm going to do. I mean,
Absolutely.
I think there's so many, you're talking about the weaving together. There are so many things in our world that could stand to be woven together right now. I think you have to pick which one you're gonna champion. But I think this has been a wonderful, really interesting conversation for sure.
You know, one of the funny things about implicit bias is that I think if we're really self-aware and sort of in touch with ourselves, we catch ourselves in the implicit bias. And when you do, you go, oh, that was not good. And where did that come from? I.e. myself in Paris, France, 3 years ago before COVID, at a conference, getting up in the morning, it's 6 o'clock and I'm going down to the restaurant for breakfast. I cannot figure out the coffee machine. And I turn to the guy who works there and I say, excuse me, can you help me make this work? He comes over, he helps me make this work. And I thank him and I sit down, only to realize that the gentleman was another guest and he just happened to be Black. I immediately assumed he worked there. Well, it was totally innocent. But it was a huge bias. And what was that about? And how could I do that? So, you know,
I really appreciate you saying that, Michael, because haven't we all had those moments where we are struck with it and go, oh, like I feel really icky about that. And you know, like I remember when I joined the Army, and I live in Montana. I grew up in Montana. I didn't know a lot of Black people, but I hadn't thought about it. I didn't think about, I watched Fresh Prince and Family Matters, and I just thought I was normal. And then I got to my first duty station and one of my NCOs was Black, and he made the comment, I bet you're the kind of girl who locks her doors when you drive through certain neighborhoods. And I was like really taken aback and insulted by that. And I think A, it showed that he had implicit bias as well, but B, it was the first time I had even thought about whether or not I had had any actions or done anything that would have caused somebody of a different race harm. I'd never even thought about it. And I think that's implicit bias too, right? That everybody else functions the same as me, that everybody sees the world the way I do, and that nothing I do could cause harm to somebody else. That was a really hard awakening for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those individual stories that we have and these experiences where we're confronted with these biases, those are the growth opportunities. Those are the moments when you go where you can really move forward. And I think another area really where all of us are challenged right now is with folks who are neurodiverse and the autism spectrum, and who do see the world in very different ways, and from the emotional side, the pictorial side, and so it's a fascinating topic and it's exciting, and I really think it's so much opportunity. Rather than seeing it as sort of this dark thing, I think it just offers this exciting chance to broaden ourselves.
I love
I
that.
agree with that.
Maybe where do we go from here is just continuing to be curious, which I think is the key. Curiosity seems to be the thing that all of these conversations keep coming back to. And maybe that's a good place. We're right at an hour now. So do we leave it with curiosity for the day?
Anyone have anything before we go? Because it's been delightful, but if there's someone still urgently needing to speak. All right, then back to
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. And
Yes.
take care. Thank you, LaSalle.
Thank you guys so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael and Callie. Really appreciate you guys facilitating the conversation.
Yeah.
It was great. Look forward to the next one.
Me too. I think we have Inez and Nathan next.
And Callie, I'll get this all recorded and back out for everybody.
Okay, so am I okay to leave?
You are okay. I'm gonna take it from here. So good to see you, Pam, Priscilla, Michelle, everyone that's still there, and Callie. So good to see you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we will talk soon.
Yes, love your hair.
Oh, thank you. I did it myself.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, everybody.
Bye,
Check
guys.
in next week or later this week for the recording, okay? Goodbye.